So now that we've discussed how gender and sex are both socially constructed, let's talk about how we as members of a society come to learn the meanings and the implications of gender. Well, we've already introduced this topic of socialization earlier in the semester, so I'm going to go through this information somewhat quickly here because this should be much of a refresher. But essentially, socialization is this ongoing process through which people learn the appropriate norms, values, and behaviors for a particular group in society. Why does socialization matter? Well, it matters because without proper socialization, we would fail to learn the norms, values, and behaviors of a society. Remember, we talked about social development and self-development, and we watched the video about the young girl who was a feral child who had very little social interaction as a young child, and as a result, she missed out on the necessary socialization to develop her mind and develop her brain so she could kind of advance into higher levels of critical thinking, right? So socialization is very important because we need to learn the norms and values of our society to know how we're expected to behave and operate in any given society that we live in, right? So socialization teaches us virtually all aspects of our social life, things from physical activities, right? Knowing how to walk, how to eat appropriately, aspects of our material culture, things like how to properly tie a shoe, how to properly hold a fork, and also our non-material culture, right? So knowing that if we go out to eat at a restaurant, we need to wear a shirt and shoes if we want to get service, or knowing that it's considered rude in our culture to chew with your mouth open, right? All of these behaviors, right? Physical activities, material culture, non-material culture, they are all learned through this process of socialization. How does socialization occur? Well, like we talked about before, it occurs through agents of socialization, right? The people or institutions that are teaching us the expected norms, values, and beliefs of any given society. Some popular examples of agents of socialization are people, peer groups such as friends and family, education, school systems, religions, and the media, of course. All different agents of socialization that teach us how we are expected to behave and what beliefs we're supposed to hold as members of any given society. Well, in terms of gender, we go through a specific process of socialization called gender socialization. And essentially, it's the same definition, but just instead of learning the general norms or beliefs of a society, gender socialization teaches us the gender norms or the beliefs associated with a specific gender in any given society. So while we're all assigned a gender at birth, we are not born with an understanding or the knowledge of how gender norms operate, right? Like I've been saying in previous videos, boys aren't born with a predisposition for the color blue or knowing that they should want to play football, just the way that girls aren't born with a predisposition for the color pink or knowing that they should want to become a ballerina. Those are learned behaviors, and they are learned through the process of gender socialization. So we learn the gender norms of our society through this process of socialization, similar to the way we learn the norms associated with other facets of the cultures and societies that we live in. So what does gender socialization do? It teaches us the appropriate feminine or masculine behavior or gender norms depending on our gender. If I'd ask you, what are some gender norms that are associated with femininity or masculinity? I'm sure that you could each list many of them. And something that's important to note is that depending on where you were raised and where you're from, traits, behaviors, norms, values that you associate with femininity versus masculinity are likely going to be different, right? If you grew up in Texas, you probably associate masculinity with things like football, barbecuing, drinking beers, maybe going hunting, things like that. Whereas if you grew up specifically in an urban area in the United States, for example, New York City, you might more strongly associate things like socioeconomic status or physical appearance and things like that with being masculine. So it depends on where you grew up, even regionally within the same country, can have an impact on what you associate with feminine or masculine traits, right? Another good example is that if a man wore, for example, like a scarf or something in New York City, or took very good care of their appearance, their physical appearance was always very clean, wearing suits all the time, that's something that might be considered kind of unmasculine in parts of the United States. But like I said, in urban areas, larger cities, a man who presents themselves very cleanly and properly like that can be considered a masculine trait in those specific geographic regions. So it varies from context to context, which again provides further evidence that gender is a social construct. So why does gender socialization matter? Well, our society is built on a shared understanding that people will follow the gender norms that any society has set in place from them. And from a very, very young age, we are socialized to expect that people should and will follow these gender norms. So if you remember back when we talked about norms in general, the reason that they're important for society is because they help us just kind of carry out mundane behaviors without much thought. And the same is true with gender norms in a society, right? If I'm a man, I don't wake up in the morning and contemplate, oh, do I want to put on lipstick today? Do I want to wear a dress or pants? Those behaviors are kind of built into the gender norm script for what a man is supposed to do. No, I'm not going to wear lipstick. No, I'm not going to wear a dress today, because those aren't behaviors that are associated with men and masculinity in our society. So gender norms kind of facilitate our processes. If I'm out in public, I don't need to decide which restroom I'm going to use. I'm going to go into the men's restroom because that's what we're socialized to do. That's the gender normative behavior expectation for us. So what happens in a society when people do not follow the gender norms that are expected of their culture? What would happen if I decided to go to work one day, come to TAM-UCC wearing lipstick and wearing a dress? What would the repercussions be? Well, with regular norms, when you break a gender norm, you put yourself at risk of experiencing a sanction, and typically it's going to be a negative sanction, right? If I broke the gender norms in terms of my appearance and presented myself wearing clothing or makeup associated with women and femininity, I'd probably get a lot of dirty looks. Some people might say some pretty mean things to me in passing by, etc. And those negative sanctions are society's way of trying to control people to follow the gender norms that we associate with whatever sex we categorize those people in, right? So if I presented myself in a very feminine way where people didn't question my sex, maybe people thought, wow, if I look exactly like they would expect a woman to look, or someone who was assigned female at birth, and I presented femininely, I wouldn't get called out. But if they would sex categorize me as being male and think I'm presenting feminine, then I might experience those negative sections. So sex and gender are inextricably linked to each other in that way. Like we talked about earlier in the semester, socialization, specifically gender socialization, takes place at a very young age. If you remember watching this video, these little kids that are probably no older than 3 or 4 years old were able to tell you which doll stays home and takes care of the kids, and which doll goes home or goes out and works, etc. They also knew from a very young age that if they broke the gender norms expected of them, that they would experience negative sanctioning, right? One of the kids, when asked, what would happen if you came to school dressed like a girl? And they said, all of the kids would make fun of me. So they know that it's bad to break gender norms from a young age. And this is because they've been socialized from a very young age through the media, through interactions with their parents and their teachers, to learn that there are behaviors that good boys should follow and behaviors that good girls should follow, and that it's important not to cross those paths, because if you do, you will experience a negative sanction. So toys are a huge agent of socialization, right? Toys teach children a lot about behaviors that are good or desirable for them depending on their gender. We looked at these images earlier in the semester, right? Look at all of the behaviors that get attached to this little girl's play set here, right? There's a doll teaching her to be a good mom. It's a kitchen teaching her how to bake and to be a good homemaker. There's a phone in the kitchen even, maybe giving the impression that she should learn how to answer the phone while she's also taking care of the children and baking, to multitask in that way, or perhaps to get used to this task of answering phone calls for a future job as a secretary or receptionist. Conversely, the boy's toolkit, teaching him how to work with his hands, how to build things, how to construct things, traits that we typically associate with men and masculinity more so in our society. Easy Bake Oven is another classic example of a toy that, again, socializes or is intended to socialize specifically young girls into the role of becoming a mother, becoming a homemaker. What gender norms does this Easy Bake Oven reinforce for girls? Well, many of the same things I said in the last one, this idea that women are expected to cook and maintain the household for both themselves and their families. And it's interesting because this is the toy that's clearly marketed towards young girls, right? Little kids see this and they see girls specifically playing with the toys and the advertisements on the box or on the commercials, and that's a form of gender socialization, indicating to young children that this is a toy specifically designed for girls, right? It's also not a coincidence that the packaging and the toy itself are using stereotypical girl colors, right? Pinks, purples, yellows, etc. Very clear who this toy is marketed for and the behaviors that are being associated with it. Now, when I was little, I always wanted an easy bake oven because I love to cook. Parents never got it for me, but they were willing to get me a similar Queasy Bake Oven, right? So this, in comparison to the Easy Bake Oven, obviously being marketed to little boys instead of to little girls. So the premise of the Easy Bake Oven is to produce these beautiful, tasty treats that you can share with your friends. The purpose of the Queasy Bake Oven is to make these disgusting treats that are supposed to gross out people, because that's what little boys are supposed to be into, right? So instead of making these nice little chocolate cakes or these funfetti pink cakes here, you can make looks like a what's it, mud and crud cake, or a dip in drool dog bone. Those sound delicious, right? And again, the intent behind this being geared towards young boys is that boys should like things that are gross, that are disgusting, that aren't clean, that are messy, right? But girls should be very prim and proper, they should be dainty, and they should, again, be socializing themselves into this role of becoming a future mother, a future homemaker, whereas boys can kind of look at this idea of baking as a joke, right? Why would I ever need to learn the skills to bake or to cook anything? I'm not going to have to do that when I grow up. Right? And then also looking at the packaging, how it's different, right? This is obviously very cleanly advertised. It's supposed to look pretty and aesthetically pleasing. You know, the Queasy Bake is the disgusting name to begin with, but then, you know, the gross tongue coming out of the queue, and they won't even call it an oven, they call it a cookerator, right? Again, a lot of jokes trying to kind of play fun at this idea that boys shouldn't need to learn how to bake unless they're making something that's intentionally gross to gross someone out, right? So a lot of these kind of subliminal messages that get told through toys can produce some problems for our society. So in the final presentation, we're going to take a look at how gender socialization can produce and does contribute to systems of gender inequality.